Good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled An Expert Panel on Decentralized Trials, Pre- and Post-COVID-19. My name is Samaya and I'll be your X-Talks moderator for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes with time for a question and answer session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive and webinars work best when you're involved, so please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A time. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please also note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Castor EDC, who developed the content for this presentation. Castor enables manufacturers and research organizations to optimize clinical trials through the capture of high-quality clinical data that are reusable, thus maximizing their impact. Castor's capabilities include EDC to maximize productivity in clinical trials and integrate data from multiple sources, such as clinicians, patients, devices, and EHR systems, electronic patient-reported outcomes, forms, and to administer surveys and collect clinical data into a central platform, e-consent, and other custom solutions. Now, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's event. And our first speaker is Craig Lipset, former head of clinical innovation at Pfizer. Craig is an internationally respected advisor, educator, and thought leader. Craig has received Hall of Fame recognition among Pharma Voice's most inspiring people in life science. Our second speaker is Kai Langel, the director of clinical innovation at Janssen. Kai brings global experience in development, delivery, and consultation of patient-centric solutions for clinical trials. An out-of-the-box thinker, Kai's passion for developing innovative, workable solutions provides a unique viewpoint. Our next speaker is Paul Bodfish. As VP of Corporate Services at the Medical Research Network, Paul is responsible for overseeing contracts, vendor management, quality management systems, and technology and data-related activities. Paul also provides operational support for site and research nurses as part of his diverse duties. Our final speaker is Derk Arts. Dr. Derk Arts has over 10 years of experience in medicine, research, and data management. In 2012, he founded Castor to enable researchers and manufacturers to maximize the impact of data through clinical trial automation and data reuse, while supporting a patient-centric, decentralized approach to research. So now, without further ado, I'd like to hand the presentation over to our speakers. You may begin when ready.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Very happy to be here with all of you on Clinical Trials Day, no less. So amazing that we could pick this date to do a webinar with a panel this strong. We're going to start with a short introduction, making sure everyone gets a brief opportunity to reflect on what they're working on and what they see around us. And I think what's interesting is that all the people we have here on this call are involved in the Trials at Home initiative, which is a large IMI project. And Kai, maybe you can kick off by telling us a little bit about Trials at Home and your involvement there.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Derk. Thanks for having us. So Trials at Home indeed is a large IMI initiative. So if you don't know IMI, it is the world's largest public-private partnership in life sciences. IMI 1 and 2 altogether is more than 5 billion euros that is put towards into this innovation project. So Trials at Home is one of them, and my role in the project is to be the industry side technology lead to figure out a new technology solution for running these remote decentralized trials in Europe. So in the project, we have 31 partners. So there's 15 or 16 FPA companies, so mostly large pharma. And then on the public side, we have technology companies, there's startups, there's academia, there's research partners. MRN, so Paul is one of the project members as well. So it's a fantastic opportunity for us to collaborate between industry and these public partners to get some new thinking into how clinical trials could be done differently. and it gives us an external environment to run these experiments, so we can kind of push the boundaries a little bit more than what we could do, for example, with my role at Janssen. So this is one of the reasons why these external innovation engagements are really, really important. We can work together to solve some of the challenges that we all face in running clinical trials. So that's it in a nutshell.
Awesome, thank you so much for that overview. And am I correct that Craig Lipset is also involved on the Trials at Home side?
Craig?
Yes, that is correct. I'm participating in the external advisory group that Trials at Home has put together to help provide additional vetting of the strategies and priorities and external advocacy, really complementing so many of the experts that the IMI is already able to bring together from so many participating organizations.
Okay, thanks. That's I think it's amazing to have so many people involved, on this panel. And Paul, maybe you could go next and tell us a little bit more about yourself and particularly MRN and its involvement in the Trials at Home initiative.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. And firstly, it's just I'm truly honoured to be in such a esteemed company today. So I hope our audiences appreciate all of you guys getting together, because this is a great panel. So. Firstly, our MRN's initiative, ultimately is to be part of community-based trials. So when we started 14 years ago, our aim as a business was to bring clinical trials away from the trial site into the community, and we do that today by enabling technology and partnering with technology organisations like Castor, but primarily by putting nurses into the patient's home to perform complex therapy administrations such as IP infusions, but also performing more of the simple tasks such as blood sampling and other sort of cognitive or any other assessments that might need doing. The Trials at Home initiative for us is an opportunity really to bring some of our at-home nursing skills and expertise to the table, but also to help drive the industry in the direction which we believe it has to go. And I think the reason we're all here today is because we firmly believe that the industry has to move away from a site-based model, become more patient-centric, and use technology and decentralized trials in a more normal way. And I think the pandemic has really forced the issue, which is why I think today's discussion is going to be so exciting.
Absolutely, thank you so much for that. And yeah, I think it will be easy to conclude that we're all super aligned on the importance of making trials more patient-centric, maybe even more so than before. But I think the need was already very high, but now the urgency is also there, which puts us in a very interesting place. And I think that's one of the topics we'll be discussing. Before we move on into the subsections that we're going to touch on, Craig, could you maybe reflect a little bit on, from your position? I know you've been involved in a lot of webinars and you're getting pulled into a lot of sort of questions and projects around, creating more hybrid trials. What have you seen so far? Is there any significant changes that you've noted? Can we already sort of speak of a revolution that's going on, or is that too much to ask?
Well, Derk, I think before the pandemic, we had seen a space where there were a lot of conversations, there were a lot of investments that were being made in terms of new companies and new offerings in the market. But in truth, there was a lot more supply than demand. We saw a space where most pharma companies had done some experiment, some series of studies that maybe use decentralized approaches in a big way, but nothing at a meaningful scale, nothing with meaningful adoption at that time. When COVID-19 hit and things started to shut down, when new studies ground to a halt, when enrollment pretty much stopped, when all attention was on trial continuity, I think most organizations were of the mindset that 3 months. If I can get through 3 months with minimized missed doses and minimized missing data, I'll be okay. But I believe now most drug development organizations are of the mindset that for the patients with chronic diseases that we're most often looking to enroll in our studies, this isn't a 3-month exercise. And when we have this this high probability that COVID-19 may subside in certain geographies, but may flare back up, the appreciation that these strategies have to be more than protocol deviations. They have to be more than SOP waivers. And so it's an interesting time now that we're starting to see organizations really commit and change their processes, change their vendor lists, start to rethink how they're writing their studies going forward. That's a real tipping point, Derk, right? Because that's that tipping point between a lot of talk around the space and really starting to see organizations commit. Because let's face it, these strategies are no longer perceived as risk. They are the risk mitigation strategies to get any studies up and running to have recruitment resume anywhere in the world right now.
I think
that's a great point.
Sorry, Derk, I was just saying, I think I could probably provide some evidence to support what Craig was saying. Within MRN, in the last 3 months, we will have seen a number of home visits triple. So that is in essentially an 8 to 10 week period. And this is a mixture of existing trial patients who were being supported in a hybrid way. So some of their visits were at the trial site, some were in the home. And now the majority of those patients are being seen in the home. But we've also had a mix and a large mix of new trials coming in that were probably about to start anyway, and they're applying a hybridized model. So this is happening and it is real.
Yeah, that's very impressive. And so we're really moving beyond the wait and see approach into actual action, which I think is very exciting. And yeah, that's probably one of the main topics we're going to be speaking about. Let's progress to the first subsection, which is preceded by a quick poll.
Great. So audience members, you should be seeing that poll question on your screens right now. So that poll question is, how familiar are you with conducting decentralized or hybrid trials? So your options are not familiar at all, or some familiarity but never conducted one, or conduct decentralized trials currently, or not sure. So you can go ahead and vote on what suits you best just by clicking on your screen, and it should come straight to us. So once again, that question is, how familiar are you with conducting decentralized or hybrid trials? Your options are not familiar at all, some familiarity but never conducted one, conduct decentralized trials currently, or not sure. So it seems like the majority of audience members have voted, so I'll go ahead and close the poll right now. And you should be seeing the result on your screens. Right, so it seems like 49% of audience members voted for some familiarity but never conducted one. After that, not familiar at all at 30%, and then at 15% conduct decentralized trials currently, and lastly at 6% it was not sure. Back to you.
Excellent. Yeah, so I think let's do our best to make sure that we give the audience some actionable points to take home. Also, the people that are not familiar with decentralized trials at all. And so the first topic, yeah, I think interesting to look at a graphic that IQVIA put out recently. Can we go to that slide? Where they're basically showing an overview of how we could approach changing the original study design into an adapted design that's going to be more hybrid. And while I think this image is very enticing, and obviously, Castor is a company that's always working at the forefront of innovation and trying to make sure we enable our customers to these types of activities. I've also from previous webinars seen that from a regulatory standpoint, these are quite significant changes you'd be making to an existing protocol. And so my initial impression when seeing this was, well, it looks very exciting, but I think especially for ongoing studies is going to be a real challenge to make some of these changes. I think what I've seen personally is a lot of freedom to add activities to keep patients engaged and to make sure there's some form of remote data capture, but not necessarily the freedom to swap out entire endpoints. And I want to deep dive that a little bit more in for this segment, but maybe Craig, you can reflect on this initially, and I would love the others to respond to that. What do you think when you see this? Is this to what extent do you think this can be applied in the real world?
Well, I think that our audience can probably give themselves more credit than they do, because we can think less about just entirely decentralized trials and maybe take that step back and be more expansive in what we think about as decentralized methods. And how do we take a more incremental approach? And incremental in this case is not a compromise. In many cases, when we stop and we talk and listen to patients about what's important to them in a given therapeutic area around participation, it's not about putting everything in their homes. For many patients, hybrid isn't a compromise, it's the desired end state. And so when we use things like ePro and eCOA, which most sponsors have had a significant amount of experience with over the years, we are using decentralized methods, and we know that we can amplify that even more. I think this slide does a nice job of highlighting some of the different strategies that can be deployed that can bring those decentralized methods into our studies and start to increase opportunities for patients to choose how to participate in ways that make research most accessible to them. And that's really our desired goal in doing this, right? Is to make sure that patients, wherever they are, whatever they are in their journey, wherever they are geographically, that they're able to access research participation.
And one of the nice opportunities with this situation is that this is a mass experiment that's happening now globally, where ongoing trials had to implement these measures because of the emergency. So there are now studies moving from paper COA to eCOA in the same study, and that was a big no-no. Nobody would knowingly do that and plan to do that, and therefore we have very little data to see if there really is a difference. Like, is the data different, or doing some assessments over telemedicine versus doing them at clinic? We don't know whether there is a difference. So now we have, hundreds or even thousands of studies doing exactly that. So I'm quite curious to see what comes out of that. And is there real difference in the data? Is it worse? Is it better? Is it the same? We don't know, but I think that will be a very interesting outcome of all of this. So I think once the dust settles, I hope we find some ways to actually collate some of these learnings to see what did we learn as an industry and what methods there actually would stick in the future. And is it really such a bad thing to have some mixed method in the same study, and maybe we can improve the flexibility for participants, for sites, for researchers to offer multiple options, even in the same trial or in the same program at least. So I'm quite curious to see what we can learn from this mass experiment that would never ever happen without us being forced to do something like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, Kai, I think we see some of this today, don't we, Kai, with the flexibility we offer on hybrid trials where patients have the opportunity to have a more traditional approach or to take a more decentralized approach. But I think where we mustn't forget to focus is on how the regulators will view this flexibility. So will they work in line with us, or will they be pushing back at certain points? And I think the guidance that's been released today does cut, I think, sponsors of trials some slack. But I think ultimately they're still expecting some compliance at a high level down the line. So we mustn't take our eyes off where the regulators are positioning themselves with regards to the current situation.
Yeah, I fully agree. And Kai, you mentioned you see hundreds or maybe thousands of trials, adopting new methods. Where is that information coming from? Do you know what kind of changes they're making, and what dictates success? So for our viewers, let's say they have an ongoing trial, what are some of the key areas they maybe should consider focusing on if they want to make adaptations? Let's say they've adopted the wait and see strategy so far, but now they're thinking, all right, it's time to act. So what do you think have been successful changes already that you've observed?
Well, it might be a bit early to say how successful it will be, because we need to actually run through this experiment, gather all the data, and see what happened. But some of the measures I see being taken around me, some of the key capabilities, right now, like Greg mentioned earlier, like recruitment is halted unless you have a way to recruit remotely. So that's where like remote consenting and these kind of capabilities come into play. With running regular study visits and assessments, that's where you need telemedicine. you need home health nursing. These are some of the basic capabilities that a few months ago were innovative and novel and nice ideas, and a lot of that is now routine practice being deployed into trials. So that's some of the action I've seen taken. What will be interesting to see once these studies run their course, to see and compare the data before COVID to the post-COVID, and see what methods were applied, what impact it have to have on the data. Is there bias? Is there not bias? And then this will also be important data to convince the regulators that, look, this is what we did, this is what the data tells us, and this is how we would recommend the guidance goes in the future as well when we are through this crisis. And I hope some of these success stories will then stick, and we'll be able to allow those things to continue. On the other hand, I see some of the studies that are already remote. So I'm involved in some of these, working with one university, for example, where the remote study that I'm part of running is the only study that is still running in that university. Everything else is on hold. And I happened to be speaking with the chief HF study from Janssen yesterday. So this is the fully remote Janssen study that's been widely published in the media. And they said that the only impact they saw really was in the IRB submission timelines, because they had to prioritize COVID studies and those things. But their recruitment is basically running as before, despite this crisis, because nobody has to travel. So remote studies are being quite successful. If you were lucky enough to be running one before this, we have some really solid evidence that operations continue as normal. So yeah, those are some of the things that I've seen.
Yeah, I think that's great input, and I think worst case we might not be able to switch all our ongoing trials over to more hybrid approaches, but at least we'll have a lot of data to support decentralizing trials in the future. Because we're moving quickly through time, we want to move on. So we have a next poll question coming up, and then Kai, I think you can deep dive a little bit further in what you were just mentioning. So can we get the next poll?
Right, so audience members, you should be seeing the second poll question on your screens. That question is, what type or types of informed consent do you use? So your options are paper consent, or e-consent, or a combination of both, or neither, or not sure. So once again, you can go ahead and click on the option that suits you best. And that question is, what type or types of informed consent do you use? So that's paper consent, e-consent, a combination of both, neither, or not sure. Give you a couple more seconds to answer that, and then I'll go ahead and close the poll. All right, so it seems like the majority of audience members have voted, so I'll go ahead and close the poll right now. And the results are as follows. So paper consent at 63% was with the highest number of votes, followed by a combination of both at 21%, and then neither at 7%. After that, e-consent at 6%, and lastly, not sure at 3%. Back to you.
So still a lot of opportunity for change. So Kai, on this topic, you touched on it already briefly. So you have seen some success with adopting e-consent strategies, and so with the current COVID situation and the shifting innovation horizon, that's also creating new needs. So what opportunities and ideas should we look for, and should we look forward to in the future? Can you comment on that? Yeah,
so as somebody who's always been an innovator, this has created an interesting new situation where a few months ago, some of the things that we just mentioned were still considered to be really innovation. But today, because a lot of this stuff that we were working on, like telemedicine, home health nursing, this is now standard practice. So innovators also have to rethink. And with something like Trials at Home, which is a 5-year project, we need to make sure that we focus on activities that would be still considered innovative in 5 years' time. So we would look a bit silly if we come up with some recommendations for telemedicine and release them in 5 years' time. We would not be very relevant. So I've been pushing some new ideation. So luckily, I've had new, fresh ideas in my back pocket to apply in exactly this kind of situation. I think one of the things that this crisis exposed from the industry is that we are not very flexible. we have hard time adapting. I mean, we've actually done a pretty good job in adapting and bringing these two tools on board quite quickly, so that's good. But if you think about, imagine like a COVID vaccine study, and this is actual work that many people are now doing. It's a high priority for the world. So if a strategy for vaccination, for example, is a ring strategy, meaning that you want to vaccinate people who have been exposed to the virus, like a family member of somebody who's been exposed, a colleague, and so on. So we need new capabilities to basically capture those people that we need to vaccinate. And that's quite hard thing to do in an epidemic that is quite hard to predict. We don't know where these hotspot areas happen, so we can't open trial sites all over the place, keep them running in case something happens there. So I think what we need is basically an equivalent of a quick response force that the military might have. So we need to be able to spin up a research capability in an area where we need it, equip that capability with all of the tools that you need, like ability to vaccinate people, do physical exams. But once that physical contact is done and people have been vaccinated, that team no longer is needed. So we can bring them back home and do the rest of the follow-up using a virtual capability. So this way we would be able to deploy these capabilities into different areas, reach people that are even in remote locations to be able to do this kind of research. So that's, I call this concept like a pop-up site. So you can pop up a site where you need it and you close it down when you no longer need it. And some of these sites could even be deployed using like mobile units, like a van. You put all the things you need in the van, you drive the van to where it needs to go to and do its job, and then come back home. That would be much more effective in onboarding people and reaching people and being a bit more flexible than the typical brick and mortar process where we have a fixed physical location where all of the activities take place. So something like that could be a new way of trying out some of these things. And also a bit than what MRN is doing, figuring out ways how to do recruitment in the community from GPs, how to onboard GPs as researchers, and then tap into the local research capabilities around potential patients. So I think these are some of the new, horizons for innovation. I think maybe the pre-COVID innovation was like online recruitment and these kind of things, and I think we now need to think beyond that. I'm also involved in some very clever ways of doing telemedicine, remote cognitive assessments, where we can really do very fantastic things with video streams that we can analyze people's mood, analyze the speech, and extract many new features for better screening and things like that. So there are lots of good avenues for exploration and bringing on board these innovative capabilities, and that's where where I'm looking at now post crisis, or well, we're still in the crisis, but that's where my mind is.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you now have to move your sort of innovation horizon even further out, because a lot of the innovation is suddenly happening all around us. And I think the point you shared on sort of innovative trial designs. We are supporting the WHO on several high impact projects, and we're actually quite close to some of the work they did around the Ebola vaccines. And I think that's extremely interesting and super exciting. Like for me, seeing how they approach that, I think they're adopting some of the things you're mentioning in working in communities and popping up trial sites in the middle of the jungle. Yeah, for me, that's such a novel way of conducting research, and I think bringing that actually to urban areas as well. So imagining in our neighborhood. Having a mobile trial site, going around and going door to door to screen for eligibility to trials, I think is very novel and very exciting. And then if we can involve the primary care physician into that process, even better, or start there and reach out from there in a sort of ring design as the WHO adopted, I think very exciting. And maybe Paul or Craig, any additional quality you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think our biggest challenge actually is going to be how we replace the physician-patient interaction, because there are some disease states that lend themselves better towards a more decentralized approach than others, but there will be some disease states today where that physical interaction, where the physician and the medic has to assess a patient by touch or feel, That today is going to be extremely difficult to replace. So I think we need to use technology to find different ways. Maybe it's artificial intelligence, looking at some of the nanorobotics technology that's changing, how we can move away from that interaction, because we can have all of these novel ways of identifying patients and bringing them into trials. But if we're still reliant on face-to-face interaction in order to assess patients' state, then that's gonna halt the progress that we might make.
I think that decentralized trials creates an incredible opportunity for us to engage treating physicians who are not investigators in research in exciting new ways. Patients like their doctors, and study after study tells us that patients want to learn about research from the physician that is treating them. And yet participation today requires serendipity. You happen to go to a physician that happens to be an investigator in a study in order to make that connection. When we bring decentralized trials into communities, there's an opportunity for us to rethink our engagement with local treating physicians. Now, one option for a treating physician is to become an investigator, but we know that's not right for most physicians out there. There are the models of integrated research organizations, IROs, that can bring the people, process, and tech and make it easier for that physician to become a PI, but it's still not right for every physician. And certainly we don't want every investigator in the community to be, every physician has to be an investigator. But instead, this opportunity for us to take the spirit of decentralized trials and enable the work to be done by that remote physician and create those new opportunities for physicians to have informed conversations with their patients about participation can be remarkable. I think the idea of bringing trials into communities is really exciting, like was just being mentioned. One lesson that I've learned is not to think so much about building a bridge that goes into those communities, but how we build bridges out. The perception of us rolling in of, it's sort of in the US, we have this jargon of we're here from the government, we're here to help, rather than how we can start locally in those communities. And we think about those in the US and, for instance, in local barbershops and local pharmacies and places that are right there and proximal, they're known, they're trusted, the churches in the communities in different urban areas. And how can we create those into those hubs for people to learn about research in places that are familiar, that are already trusted? I think one last note that I'll put out in this theme of remote enrollment in particular, here in the US, there's been, I think, an exciting announcement that was just made about a month ago around an open API initiative related to data. This is being driven by the Department of Health and Human Services in the US, HHS, and this open API, this API-based approach is meant to enable citizens to have access to their health data in ways that they've never had before, using a standardized approach that can let me as a consumer access all of my diverse health data. And when we think about patients being empowered to support remote enrollment, this is going to be a remarkable catalyst and breakthrough for us, that we don't have to have the delays of trying to get forms submitted to get access to medical records to confirm one's eligibility, but instead when we have an interested and engaged patient, they can bring that data in themselves and support their participation.
Yeah, that's a very interesting project, and we'll make sure to share the background of that with our viewers so they can reflect on that. In the interest of time, I wanna move on. I would want to end at the end to name some success factors around, practical success factors around switching to more remote enrollment and e-consent strategies. So Kai, maybe you can think about that question. But before we dive into that, maybe we could go into the next poll.
All right, so you should be seeing poll question number 3 on your screens. So that question is, how does your organization collect research data? So your options are electronic data capture, or paper forms, or it's a mixture of both, or not sure. So once again, that question is, how does your organization collect research data? So your options are EDC, electronic data capture, or it could be paper forms, or a mixture of both, or not sure.
this is actually an old poll question, so can we make sure that we have the right poll question for the next one? Let's just go ahead with this one now.
Okay. Right, so I'll go ahead and close the poll and share those results for you. So this one's a little more tied. So the first at 46%, it was EDC, and then very closely followed by that was at 45%, a mixture of both, and then paper forms at 4%, and lastly at 5%, it was not sure. So that was actually just before that. Thank you for your participation.
And we originally tried to investigate if people were considering making significant changes to the trial, but we'll save that one for later. So on to the next section on remote data capture and telemedicine. So Craig taking the lead here. And so, yeah, Craig, I think on the practical side, can we expect to switch to remotely measuring outcomes for an existing study? What are your expectations there? What have you seen? You know, what is sort of a practical approach that our viewers should take here when considering switching to remotely measured outcomes?
You know, Derk, a lot of people will ask a very related question, which is which studies are right, which studies are not right for remote and decentralized approaches. And while there are always some profiles of studies, maybe there is a study that's a PK study that has very aggressive blood draw schedules, or other unique instances, an infused therapy that's doing dose escalation. But in general, to me, the rate limiter for the ability to decentralize a study is the endpoint itself. And when we choose endpoints for studies that are restrictive in how they're being acquired, that require a visit, but maybe we could have reconsidered that up front. Maybe we could have looked at alternatives using new, more novel endpoints, new digital strategies for acquiring that data. That ultimately is what constrains us. I think a favorite example right now is the 6-minute walk test. Studies that aren't able to acquire their endpoint data because their model required a human to travel a great distance just to be watched walking about on a 20-meter track for 6 minutes seems ludicrous, right, in today's day and age. But when that method is what was used by the last study, then there's a certain safety and comfort to it. And it's not just people being lazy, right? That's perceived as having less risk. It's more familiar to the regulators, the payers, the prescribers, and all of the different stakeholders. And that person might feel it has less professional risk. The person that used that method for a 6-minute walk test still has their job, so maybe I'll still have my job in 2 years. And yet that type of thinking, that type of endpoint today is a liability. That's what's preventing us from being able to offer patients choice in where they participate, and giving us the risk mitigation in scenarios like today when patients are unable to travel to attend a visit in person. And so to me, this really comes down to making sure that we're rethinking our endpoints, both for new studies that we're planning, and use this gift of time that we've been given to make sure we have really resilient endpoints, but as well as in the studies that we're in today. I think for many organizations, they've been aggressively looking at, how do I just capture data right now? And maybe this isn't the ideal state, and maybe the best case would have been that I validated that app-based approach a 1.5 years ago, but right now I'm going to have to capture something, or I'm going to risk losing everything. And even some data that I can try to validate in parallel is better than losing these data points entirely.
Yeah, and it's never too late to start, of course. So at least going forward, we'll be in a position that we have more resilient endpoints, as you call them. Kari or Paul, you want to reflect on what Craig just said?
Yeah, so this is a whole another topic, but that 6-minute walk test is a good example of what's happening today. So these tests are a snapshot of somebody's life, whereas many of these digital novel endpoints can be a continuous measure of what actually happens in that person's life. So it's a big deal for patients, but it's also a big deal for researchers like us. So quite often we are looking for very subtle changes in the impact of our interventions. And these can be very hard things to measure. And everybody, well, most people know that the 6-minute walk test is not a great measure that would be very sensitive to the kind of things that we want to research. It just happens to be the gold standard that's been there since forever. So these novel little endpoints are a really true game changer. It's not a nice to have operational efficiency boost or something like that. It can be a make or break technology for making better decisions about whether to continue a drug program, whether to approve a drug for the market, and for the healthcare providers and patients themselves. Like, is this the right drug for me? And if that measurement is done based on something like the 6-minute walk test, then I mean our decisions can't be all that great. So we really have to move to that world. There's significant barriers, and there is a significant new project that's trying to address that whole thing to help clarify the pathway for developing these new endpoints and basically creating the services that the ecosystem in the industry needs to actually accelerate adoption of these tools. Right now, there's too many question marks for study teams in front of them to actually choose a new endpoint versus something that's already well known, even if it's well known to be not that great, but at least it's a comfortable one that everybody knows how it works and all of that. There's too many question marks. So we are driving towards improving all those things, improving the ecosystem, clarifying the pathway for developing, qualifying these new endpoints, and hopefully we'll then see much better adoption of these tools in the future, because that will truly benefit everybody, the drug developers, the patients, the doctors out there. So everybody has to win a lot by using better tools to measure these things.
Do you, on the short term and sort of on the practical side for our viewers, do you expect more resistance on replacing an existing endpoint with a remotely measured outcome? So using video, for example, to have patients conduct a test on themselves, anything that's of course feasible, or do you expect less resistance on actually introducing a new digital endpoint, like through an app or a wearable, for example? Because my expectation would be that the latter would be even harder from a sort of regulatory perspective, and if you have to sort of explain your actions after the fact. So what should we be looking for if we want to start to bring in more data that we can actually use in our submission at the end of the road?
Well, the regulators are pretty well on board with this. They are actually pushing us to move this way. I think the significant barrier we have is at the other end with the study teams. Right now, again, it's too unclear. They don't have the right services and solutions to tap into to actually make those decisions to adopt those endpoints instead or together with the established traditional endpoints. The regulators are pretty open to this, and well, more than open, they're really pushing us. But I think we need to help the study teams to get there. Right now, it's too difficult for them to figure it all out. To find your way, you have to read 50 different recommendations, papers, and emerging guidance to figure out what you need to do. That's not really scalable, workable. That's why we need better services, more mature ecosystem to offer these study teams. Then it will be easier for them to make those decisions. The regulators are waiting for this data to come in. They're not the issue here. I don't know, Greg, you have maybe a different perspective, but
Derk, I would add, I think video can be a great middle state. I think video can be a great democratizer here. Video lets you take an otherwise dumb blood pressure cuff and make it smart, right? In the absence of a connected device, you think about it, a coordinator at a site, if they're using a digital blood pressure cuff in that instance, they're looking at the number and recording it. And so using video in this way can enable one to use a device in a home that maybe isn't as highly connected and fully baked in terms of data flow, but at least enable some of that interaction. We can also even think about ways that some assessments that may have otherwise required a lot of training because of the variability in how each site investigator was applying an instrument, that if we can have video but using central raters, just as we've done for years with a lot of neuropsychiatric studies with central reads of imaging, central reads of EKGs, to use central raters for different assessments in this model using video can actually bring the additional boost of reducing some variability while maintaining that data flow. So I think that the video is going to play a very interesting role for us here as we get to that state that Kai mentioned, that the regulators really are, certainly in the US, indicating a good deal of support around. It just requires more advanced planning on the part of sponsors to make sure that they have properly generated the data and evidence around that measurement.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
I would just add that I think a lot of these assessments and measurements are very staged, and that's traditionally how the protocols have been written. You're assessing a point in time of a patient's ability to do something or not do something, but actually the use of wearables and technology now allows you to monitor a patient real time in their own space, in their own time. So the psychology of the patient, the physicality of the patient, you're not doing it in a staged setting like a 6-minute walk test. You can gather data on a continuous basis, which actually allows you to position how that patient is reacting, perhaps with a drug or without a drug, in real time over a period of time.
And actually, just to add to that, Paul, quickly, one of the experiments that I'm involved in, we are actually measuring the physiological signs and signs of a patient doing different types of visits. So we're doing neurocognitive testing, both in clinic and over telemedicine, and at the same time we are measuring the galvanic skin response, heart rate, and many signs of stress to see what kind of physiological response there is associated with different types of visits, and then we'll see how they actually do in these tests to see if stress actually will influence the test results and things like that. So right now this experiment is on hold because we cannot see these patients. But once things get better, we'll continue with that. So they will have some hard data to show what it means to a patient, how do they react to doing a visit at home versus doing a visit at the clinic.
Thank you very much for sharing that. And in the interest of time,
so that question is, have you considered in-home visits for any of your ongoing trials or planned trials? So your options are for both ongoing and planned trials, or only for ongoing trials, or only for planned trials, or neither. So once again, audience members, that question is, have you considered in-home visits for any of your ongoing trials or planned trials? Your options are for both ongoing and planned trials, or only for ongoing trials, or only for planned trials, or that's neither. And also a quick reminder that you can still continue submitting questions and comments for our speakers as well. All right, so it seems like the majority of audience members have voted, so I'll go ahead and close the poll and share those results with you as well. So it seems like 37% of audience members voted for neither, followed by for both ongoing and planned. That was at 32%. Then next it was only for planned trials at 24%. And lastly, only for ongoing trials, that was at 8%. Thank you.
Interesting. Particularly it's a pretty big group that is at least considering changing tactics for ongoing trials. So Paul, so you already reflected on this briefly, but could you give us a somewhat better understanding of what changes you have seen? So what kind of trials have adopted in-home nursing, and what were some predictors of success? So what are some of the areas where our viewers could be looking to involve in-home visits in a way that will work going forward?
So I think I'd hate to restrict our listeners and our viewers on the types of trial, but certainly where MRN has been most successful, I think, in our history has been in the rare disease space, and this is where you've already got a well-educated patient population who have a good understanding of their disease state and have good relationships with their physicians, and I think this is where we saw the first call, if you like, from the sector was as the pandemic started. Was you had these patients who rely on regular treatment, most of that treatment being in home, but for when they were going back to those sites for those mandatory quarterly or half yearly visits, this stopped, and all of a sudden there was no easy way of assessing these patients by getting blood samples, etc. So we saw a very large increase in the patient populations we were supporting within trials. That being said, I think there were a lot of trials that weren't considering using in-home nursing visits initially that suddenly needed to do something for their patients, and so we're very quick to contact us to look for help. The things that we ask our customers to think about really is the types of activity that can be done in the home. Can you switch quickly from a physician-led protocol visit to a nurse-led protocol visit? Is there a specific assessment that needs that physician there? Can we move to a physician-led visit that's done remotely with a nurse supporting? So we've just seen in the last few weeks we're starting to support trials with telemedicine and the nursing visits. The nurse may or may not be involved, but it means at least you can replicate that physician interaction. I think one of the concerns we had about the current situation actually would be the availability of healthcare professionals generally, because if it was quite unpredictable as to whether or not nurses in particular would be pulled into the local healthcare environment. In particular, northern Italy, central Spain, there were some real hotspots for the pandemic, and we didn't know what that was going to lead to in terms of our healthcare professional availability. Arguably, I think, with all of the mitigation planning that you put in place, there's still an element of luck to that, and I think we were very fortunate in that there was no destabilization for us, and we were still able to meet the patient's needs. I think the other thing we had to consider was drug supply. So again, if you're used to sending that drug through the site to the patients, with the sites being in a complete state of panic and confusion, were they able to continue to get that drug supply out to the patients? And so I think these were other factors that had to be considered, and we've been able to help our sponsors with that.
Thank you for that. Any reflections from the other panel members?
Craig, you want to go first?
Look, I mean, we need a toolkit of options, and home visits will be an important enabler for so many studies. But as our survey results told, it doesn't fit for every. There needs to be a thoughtful matrix that's applied for which countermeasures are right for which protocols. And I think when study teams are able to take a toolkit-like approach, I think they're well served. For quite a while, I think the many sponsors became myopic around individual point solutions that were hitting the market and making a lot of noise, that sort of signaled to them that this is what a decentralized trial is. And if you're not using this model, then you're not doing a decentralized trial. But I think people are having a nice awakening that there are a suite of tools that need to be paired with a given study. And there are a lot of different approaches that fit under a decentralized umbrella. That pairing is the real magic.
Yeah, I've always thought that the home nursing capability is a key catalyst for more and more protocols being able to be deployed in this kind of model, because many protocols do have some sort of physical exam, and in those days, when you saw something like that, that protocol was out of the window, not possible in this model. With home nursing, those things are very possible, and hopefully we'll see more of that so that this becomes more routine, making that service more affordable to researchers to use, because still compared to like normal care management, like doing a simple blood draw for care delivery is pretty affordable, because that's being done at scale. Doing the same thing for clinical research is multiple times more expensive. So hopefully we'll see a bigger scale, bigger volumes, all these efficiencies of tapping into these local resources that already are in place, new business models, new players that will then make this more available to everybody, and more protocols will be able to tap into it. So I think these are some of the changes I'm looking forward to seeing in the ecosystem around us.
Yeah, awesome. And it's probably going to be a few more years before we see the full impact of everything that's happening now. But it's great that it's being kicked off at such a large scale now. And in the interest of time, I think we should move on to Q&A, but not before I ask each of you to leave our audience with one or two practical tips for them to consider if they have ongoing trials in the current day and age. That will be helpful to them. So Craig, could you share your one?
Start with the patient, start by listening, start by engaging. I think that the decentralized trial movement has been operating in a very nice parallel to the movement of ensuring that we're engaging with patients to understand their priorities and needs. Start there and let that drive where you end up bringing different decentralized countermeasures into your studies, and aim for, I believe, what our real aspiration is, which doesn't mean everything needs to be fully virtualized and in the home. I think the harder goal for us to try to target is to enable flexibility and give patients choice in how they participate. That's harder, because when we say the entire trial is in the home or the entire trial is in a clinic, that's a lot easier for us to control, but neither give patients the choice that they're looking for and that we as consumers have come to expect in our lives out of this pandemic. The world going forward for everything, education, business meetings, commerce, the world going forward is hybrid, and consumers will expect that in research participation as well.
Thanks. Paul?
Yeah, I've got quite a simple message, I think, and that's don't let what you think you know inhibit your decision making around how you design your protocol or how you change the design of your protocol, because I think, as this panel have shown, that there's a lot of people out there who have got a lot of good innovative thinking going on. So engage with those individuals before you finalize things. And the last piece, we've talked a lot about, sponsor challenges and obviously the patient challenges. We mustn't forget about the site and the PI in all of this. There's a level of engagement that's still required there. We're not at the fully virtual trial model yet, and so we mustn't forget their involvement in the trial.
Thanks. And Kai, to close off before we do a few questions from the audience.
Yeah, I would agree with Craig, start with the patient, but then I would also add that continue with the study team, because at the end of the day, it is the study teams that often make the decisions of what kind of study are they going to run. If these things are too difficult for them, services are not ready, not scalable, too expensive, not properly understood, then they'll default back to the old model. So we need to really lower the barrier for study teams to utilize these capabilities. So that's the business I'm in, making it easier for our study teams to conduct research in this way.
Excellent, thank you. And then, yeah, we're a bit short on time, but let's try to squeeze a few questions from the audience in. And I want to make sure that I tell the audience that we'll be providing answers to all your questions asynchronously. But I have one here in front of me, which I think is interesting. So, assuming we can do some assessments, outside of the site at local facilities, sort of a local blood draw or maybe an X-ray, how can that be governed from a regulatory perspective? Because very often the expectation now is that all the site personnel who's going to be interacting with the patient is GCP trained. Do we think that's shifting? How much flexibility is there? So anyone wants to take the lead on answering that question? Because there's a lot of availability of resources locally, of course. It would be great if we can tap into that.
I can start. So I think there's of course the element of oversight, which is an expectation today. So if you think about how the nursing component works, that our nurses never meet the trial physician, or very rarely. And so they're still working under delegated responsibility. So there's a process and a methodology there that can work. With regards to the GCP question, I think ultimately it's about demonstrating competence for the activities that are being delegated to you. So providing that still exists within those sub-sites, for want of a better word, then I don't see any issue. If they're not generating source data in the common and traditional way, then the element of GCP knowledge is taken away from them and is more in the hands of the people developing the technology.
Excellent. Anyone want to add to that? Or shall we move on to the next question?
Well, I think the other thing we can do is to make GCP training easily available, accessible to people. It's not a very hard thing to do. Maybe even make that a standard part of medical school curriculum, and then it's already in place. And then there will be a network of people who already have these core qualifications to be able to perform activities. So.
Okay, great. And then I think one for Paul. So in terms of drug supply, how do we think we can get the drugs to the patient? And you have a lot of experience with that, of course. Could you reflect on how that works and for what drugs that works well and where it doesn't?
Yeah, I think for so today we have drugs that are relatively stable, are being prepared at site and then are being shipped from the site direct to the patient's home using a specialist courier that's transporting the drug in a controlled manner. But we have the ability in some countries certainly to take the site out of the equation, and you can actually provide drugs centrally. So I think it's looking at how we can develop that model in other countries so that we don't have to rely on a pharmacist sitting in an overworked pharmacy in a local hospital.
And have the other panel members seen successful implementations with this approach?
Well, that is something that we are definitely thinking about in trials at home, like how do we facilitate this as direct to patient as possible, whether we can create a system that would look a bit more like an Amazon tracking system than a typical drug supply randomization system, where the patient, the participant can directly see where their shipment is, where it has been, maybe even the cold chain tracking, so they can see that it's not been sitting at the parking lot for weeks in 60-degree heat, and they can have more trust that it is in good condition and all of that. So we are also rethinking how a supply can work out, and we don't need to bother the sites and use them as logistical depots to get drug to patients. We can make it easier for sites and for patients. So that's certainly one area where we are applying some new thinking.
This is interestingly the only area when we did the remote study at Pfizer years ago. This is the only area where we needed any waiver with the FDA was around clarifying drug distribution, because the regulations on this are pretty vague around an investigator providing investigational product to the patient. But we know that for years there have been instances where patients are on holiday away from a site and the site is shipping investigational product to the participant. And so I suspect if there are any areas where we as a community need to come together to clarify, this is going to be an important one. I think that'll be great in Europe with trials at home, and maybe an interesting area for some of the initiatives in the US to take up with US regulators as well.
Great. I think we can do one or two more questions. We're running slightly over, and of course everyone has to get to the rest of their day. It is clinical trials day after all. But on the topic of e-consent, so have the panel members seen many successful e-consent implementations in interventional trials, and what type of shift do you expect to see? I know locally in the Netherlands, e-consent is still a challenging topic, but in the US, we've made a lot more progress. What have you seen, and what change are you seeing?
Well, maybe I have a nice example to begin with. So we had one fully remote study where we had the same protocol that had already been performed in a site-based setting, where people had been trained in person to use a medical device to measure blood glucose and all of that. In the remote study, we shipped everything to the patients directly, and then we used remote e-consent and training. We actually had, and it was quite complicated protocol for the participants, where they had to follow specific time windows and things like this. And right away, most patients started the study much better than in the site-based arm. So they seemed to get the content better when they started this at home. Maybe they were less distracted than being in front of the doctor and all of that, and having all digitized. I don't know exactly what the reason was, but we observed better compliance and better understanding of the protocol that they're supposed to follow. And that also required less intervention for the sites then to course correct those that didn't seem to get it. So that was really a bit of a surprise to us. We were not quite sure how that would work out, because you have to set up the device in a certain way and all that, but it worked surprisingly well.
I think the data backs up Kai's observation that when patients are using electronic informed consent, they're retaining information longer, and so it makes when we retest patients months later, the information that was delivered through an electronic informed consent versus paper is retained, and that's really what we want, right? Is a properly informed patient and informed in a sustaining way. I think that the regulatory feedback has been generally positive, like you mentioned in the US around electronic informed consent. To be honest, I think we've failed to see models for e-consent that are sponsor friendly and site friendly that can make this really scalable in a meaningful way. E-consent that's delivered as a service on a study-by-study basis is just not cost effective for sponsors in most cases. In most cases, sponsors' budgets are non-existent for informed consent. It's a document in a SharePoint that somebody's pulling down, modifying, and emailing off. On the flip side, there's the caveat that the sponsor is not even a party to the informed consent. It's a document between the site and the research participant. And so we've seen instances where large institutions have gone back to sponsors and said, e-consent's a great idea. Here is our e-consent that we use because consent is between me and the participant. Thank you for your advice. And so I think that the ecosystem we're going to probably have to start to expect in the future is one that gives sites more flexibility in the tools that they want to use. And perhaps we as sponsors then get more visibility into the compliance. We can interact with the metrics via APIs to get the data that we want, but we can let sites use the tools that are right for them so that they're not switching from one consent platform to another like we used to do in the old days of remote data capture, dropping tons of laptops on their doorstep.
That's a very interesting insight, and we'll be sure to consider that angle with our e-consent solution as well, because we're working with a lot of sites, so this might be a model we can also adopt as Castor. It's 6:07, so we're already 7 minutes over. It's clear that there's a lot to talk about here, but I want to thank the entire panel for their contribution and for being so engaged with the content with each other. Again, we'll be sending around the questions that remain to all the viewers, and of course, this session will be made available as a recording for all of you to review. So I hope you enjoyed this session and found it useful. Again, a big thank you to our panelists, and with that, I want to close off.
Okay, thank you, Derk, and everybody. Bye then.
Thanks all.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, and like Derk did mention, you will be receiving the recorded archive in the next 1 to 3 business days as well. And we hope you found this conference informative. Have a great day, everyone. Take care.